The Pygmalion effect has its origins in Greek mythology, where the sculptor Pygmalion created a statue so perfect that he fell in love with it. His desire and belief that the statue could be real led Aphrodite, the goddess of love, to bring it to life. In the psychological field, this concept was popularized by a study conducted in the 1960s by researchers Robert Rosenthal and Lenore Jacobson. They demonstrated that the expectations teachers had about their students' performance significantly influenced their academic results. In other words, if a teacher believed that a student was brilliant, that student tended to perform better even if they were not especially talented at the beginning. The experiment was revolutionary. Rosenthal and Jacobson told a group of teachers that certain students in their class had exceptional intellectual potential. Although these students had been selected at random and did not have better initial results than their classmates, after 1 year, those chosen students began to perform significantly better. Why? Because the teachers, without realizing it, treated those students differently. They gave them more time to answer questions, offered them more support, smiled at them more, and encouraged them more frequently. All of this created a chain of events that improved the students' confidence and skills. In essence, the teacher's expectations became a self-fulfilling prophecy. But this effect is not limited to the classroom. It is found everywhere, at work, in personal relationships, in sports, and even in our daily interactions. For example, if a boss expects an employee to be highly competent, they will probably give that employee more opportunities to prove their worth, which in turn will increase the employee's confidence and actual performance. On the other hand, if someone has low expectations of you, they are more likely to treat you in a discouraging way, and this can negatively influence your performance. So how can you use the Pygmalion effect to your advantage? The first step is to be aware of your own expectations. We often do not realize that our thoughts and beliefs about others influence how we treat them. If you begin to expect the best from the people around you, they are more likely to respond to those expectations. But this does not mean being naive or ignoring real problems. Instead, it means adopting a supportive and trusting attitude, giving people the tools they need to grow. You can also apply this principle to yourself. If you constantly tell yourself that you are not capable of achieving something, you are sabotaging your own opportunities before you even try. Change that narrative. Believe that you are capable, even if at first it feels like an act of faith. Confidence in yourself is the first step for others to believe in you as well. Of course, this does not mean that everything will be easy or that simply believing something will make it happen magically. But positive beliefs create an environment where effort and learning are more likely and more effective. It is important to mention that the Pygmalion effect also has a dark side, the Golem effect. This occurs when negative expectations affect a person's performance. If someone constantly tells you that you are not good enough and you end up believing it, that belief is likely to affect your results. That is why it is essential to surround yourself with people who have positive expectations of you and, in turn, to be a positive influence on others. A practical way to use the Pygmalion effect is to start by verbally expressing your positive expectations. If you have children, tell them that you trust their ability to solve difficult problems. If you lead a team, congratulate your teammates on their effort and tell them that you are confident they can achieve great things. Even a small positive comment can have a big impact. The words we use have incredible power to shape perceptions, both our own and those of the people who hear us. Another important aspect is body language. Our gestures and facial expressions also communicate our expectations. A smile, a nod of approval, or even maintaining eye contact can reinforce the idea that someone is valuable and capable. On the contrary, an indifferent look or a negative tone of voice can convey disapproval, even if that is not your intention. The Pygmalion effect is not just a psychological concept. It is a powerful tool that you can use in your daily life to transform your relationships, your goals, and your self-esteem. Start today. Believe in others. Believe in yourself, and watch how those expectations begin to change the reality around you. Have you ever met someone and within seconds formed an opinion about their character, abilities, or personality based only on their appearance or a small detail? This phenomenon has a name: the halo effect. It is a psychological shortcut that leads us to judge people, objects, or situations in a generalized way based on a single positive or negative trait. This effect constantly influences our decisions and perceptions, often without us realizing it. Let's take a deeper look at how this phenomenon works, how it affects our lives, and how we can use it consciously. The halo effect was first studied and named by Edward Thorndike, an American psychologist, in the early 20th century. During an experiment, Thorndike asked military officers to evaluate their soldiers on different aspects such as intelligence, leadership, and physical abilities. He discovered that if a soldier stood out in one of these areas, the officers tended to rate him positively in all the others as well, even if they had no concrete evidence to support it. In other words, one positive trait, such as being physically attractive or competent at a specific task, created a halo that influenced all other perceptions of that person. The halo effect is everywhere. We see it in marketing when brands use celebrities to promote products. For example, if we see a famous and admired actor wearing a certain clothing brand, we tend to associate that brand with positive qualities, such as style, quality, or success, even if we know nothing specific about the product itself. It also appears in job interviews, where a candidate who arrives impeccably dressed and smiles confidently may create a better overall impression even if their resume is not the strongest. This effect not only influences our opinions of others, but also how others see us. For example, if you stand out in something specific, such as having an excellent sense of humor or being very articulate, people may automatically assume that you are also intelligent, trustworthy, or kind, even if you have not directly demonstrated those qualities. This halo can open doors for you at work, in your social relationships, and even in everyday situations, such as asking for help or getting a favor. Of course, the halo effect also has a negative side. If someone makes a small mistake or has a trait we consider unattractive, we may judge them unfairly in other areas. For instance, if a coworker arrives late to a meeting, we might assume they are irresponsible or unprofessional, even if they actually had a valid reason. This kind of judgment can lead us to make decisions based on bias rather than facts. So, how can you use the halo effect to your advantage? The first step is being aware of its existence. Knowing that this phenomenon influences your judgments will allow you to make more objective and fair decisions. If you are evaluating someone, ask yourself, am I letting one positive or negative trait affect my perception of other aspects? Try to gather more information before reaching a conclusion. To benefit from the halo effect in your personal or professional life, focus on highlighting your strengths from the very beginning. In a job interview, for example, wear professional attire and show confidence in your first words. In social relationships, work on projecting warmth and kindness from the start. These small details can create a positive halo that influences how others perceive you in the long term. An additional tip is to apply the halo effect in your interactions with other people. If you want to motivate someone, such as a colleague or a student, start by highlighting their strengths or achievements. This will help them see themselves more positively and feel more capable of facing challenges. In addition, they are more likely to respond positively toward you. The halo effect shows us that first impressions are incredibly powerful. But remember, this phenomenon does not mean that people are only what they appear to be on the surface. Rather, it teaches us the importance of perception and how small actions or traits can have a huge impact on our lives. Use this knowledge to build stronger relationships, make more informed decisions, and project the best version of yourself. In the end, the halo effect is a tool that, when understood and used intentionally, can transform your interactions and opportunities. Have you ever wondered how some salespeople, leaders, or even friends manage to get you to say yes to something that initially seemed unlikely? One of the most effective psychological techniques for influencing people's decisions is the foot in the door technique. This method is based on obtaining a small initial commitment and, once that has been achieved, asking for something bigger. The key lies in taking advantage of the human tendency to be consistent with our previous actions. This technique is not only used in sales, but also in negotiations, personal relationships, and even social campaigns. Let's take a closer look at how it works, why it is so effective, and how you can apply it in your daily life. The name of this technique comes from a simple metaphor: a door-to-door salesperson who manages to place their foot between the door and the frame to prevent it from closing completely. Once this is achieved, it becomes easier to persuade the person to listen to the proposal. The technique was formalized by psychologists Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser in the 1960s, who demonstrated that people are more likely to agree to a large request after having agreed to a smaller one. A classic experiment that illustrates this effect involved asking participants to perform a simple action, such as placing a small sign in their windows with a message about road safety. Days later, the researchers returned and asked them for something more significant, such as placing a large sign in their yards with the same message. Surprisingly, those who had accepted the first request were much more likely to accept the second. The reason is simple. Once we do something, we tend to justify it internally and want to maintain that consistency in our future actions. The foot in the door technique is based on two key psychological principles: consistency and commitment. When someone agrees to an initial request, even a small one, they begin to see themselves as a person who supports that cause or idea. This change in self-perception makes it more likely that they will agree to later requests that are consistent with that image. Imagine that you are organizing a charity event. Instead of asking people to make a large donation right away, you could start by asking them for something small, such as signing a petition or sharing information on social media. Once they have taken that small step, they will be more willing to commit to something bigger, such as donating money or attending the event. This strategy not only increases the chances of success, but also builds a relationship of trust between the parties. The technique also works in personal relationships. For example, if you want a friend to help you with a large project, you could start by asking them to help you with a small task, such as reviewing a document or giving you a quick opinion. Once they have agreed to this first request, they will be more likely to be willing to help you with more complex tasks. It is important to use this technique ethically. While it is a powerful tool, it should not be used to manipulate people against their will or to obtain something dishonestly. The key is to align your requests with the person's values and goals so that they feel comfortable and motivated to collaborate. Of course, like any psychological technique, the foot in the door method has its limitations. It does not always work in situations where the second request is too large or beyond the person's reach. In addition, if someone feels that they are being manipulated, they may pull away or become distrustful in the future. That is why it is crucial to apply this strategy with care and authenticity. To use this method successfully, make sure that the first request is reasonable and easy to fulfill. For example, if you work in marketing, you could ask customers to sign up for a free newsletter before offering them a premium product or service. In sales, you could start by presenting an inexpensive product before introducing more expensive options, The foot in the door technique can also be a tool for personal growth. You can use this method with yourself to develop new habits or achieve bigger goals. If you find it difficult to start an important project, set a small initial goal, such as working on it for 5 minutes a day. Once you commit to this small action, it will be easier to gradually increase your level of effort. In summary, the foot in the door technique is a powerful psychological tool that takes advantage of human consistency and commitment. From sales to personal relationships and personal growth, this method can help you achieve meaningful results by starting with small steps. Remember to use it ethically and strategically, and you will see how small actions can open the door to big opportunities. Have you ever had someone ask you for something outrageous, only to then make a more reasonable request that you ended up accepting? If this sounds familiar, then you have witnessed the door-in-the-face technique. This psychological tactic is the opposite of the foot-in-the-door technique and is based on asking for something large and unrealistic at first, knowing it will be rejected, and then making a smaller request that seems much more reasonable by comparison. This strategy is surprisingly effective and is used in sales, negotiations, and even everyday life to influence other people's decisions. Below, I will explain how it works and how you can apply it in an ethical and effective way. The concept behind this technique is rooted in a psychological principle known as reciprocity. When someone rejects an initial large request, they often feel a certain level of discomfort for having said no. Then, when they are presented with a smaller request, they are more likely to accept it in order to relieve that discomfort or to make up for the previous rejection. In addition, the smaller request appears much more reasonable when compared to the first one, which increases the chances of getting a yes. A classic experiment that illustrates this technique was conducted by psychologists Robert Cialdini and his colleagues in the 1970s. In this study, researchers approached people at random and asked them to dedicate 2 hours per week for 2 years to work as volunteers in a program for juvenile offenders. As expected, almost everyone rejected the request. However, after being turned down, the researchers made a second request. They asked the same people to accompany a group of youths to the zoo for just 1 day. Surprisingly, the acceptance rate for this second request was much higher than if they had asked directly for the small favor from the beginning. The comparison with the first request made the second one seem far more reasonable. The door-in-the-face technique is not limited to laboratory experiments. It appears in many areas of everyday life. For example, a car salesperson might start by offering you a high-end model with all possible features that likely exceeds your budget. When you reject it, they then present a more basic model that, by comparison, seems much more affordable and reasonable. This method is also used in fundraising campaigns. First, a high donation is requested, such as $500. If the person refuses, they are then offered the option to donate a smaller amount, such as $20, which now feels like a minimal commitment in comparison. How can you apply this technique in your personal or professional life? The first step is to design your requests strategically. The initial request should be large enough to be rejected, but not so ridiculous that it makes the other person feel insulted or disconnected. For example, if you are organizing an event and need someone's help, you might initially ask them to take charge of all the logistics. When they decline, you can make a second, more reasonable request, such as helping with a specific task like coordinating the catering or designing invitations. It is important to use this technique ethically. It is not about manipulating or deceiving people, but about presenting your requests in a way that maximizes the chances of getting help or collaboration. When you use this technique with honesty and respect, people will not only be more willing to accept your requests, but they may also feel good about having contributed in some way. In addition, the door-in-the-face technique is useful for negotiating terms or conditions in different contexts. For instance, if you are seeking a raise, you could start by asking for a higher amount than you realistically expect to receive. When the employer rejects it, you can propose a more reasonable figure that now appears to be a fair compromise. This strategy can be especially effective if you present your requests with solid arguments and without seeming overly aggressive. Like any psychological tool, this technique has its limitations. It can fail if the first request is too exaggerated, or if the other person feels that you are trying to manipulate them. It's also less effective with people who tend to reject any request, regardless of how it is presented. That is why it's crucial to know your audience and adapt your approach to each situation. In summary, the door-in-the-face technique is a powerful psychological tactic that takes advantage of the principle of reciprocity and the contrast between large and small requests. From workplace negotiations to personal favors, this strategy can help you achieve more of what you want, as long as you use it in an ethical and respectful way. Remember that the goal is not just to get a yes, but to build relationships of trust and collaboration that benefit both parties. Have you ever noticed how the first number or piece of information you hear can influence your decisions, even when it has nothing to do with the final outcome? This is known as the anchoring technique, a powerful psychological tactic based on the human tendency to rely too heavily on the first information we receive when making decisions. This phenomenon affects everything from how we negotiate prices to how we evaluate our options in everyday life. Here, we will explore how it works, why it is so effective, and how you can consciously use it to your advantage. Anchoring was discovered and documented by psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, who showed that people tend to rely on the first information presented to them when making decisions, even if it is irrelevant or arbitrary. In one of their most famous experiments, they asked a group of people to spin a wheel with numbers from 1 to 100. Then, they asked them how many African countries were members of the United Nations. Surprisingly, those who landed on higher numbers on the wheel gave higher estimates than those who landed on lower numbers, even though the number on the wheel had no relationship to the question. This phenomenon occurs because the human brain uses the first piece of information as an anchor to evaluate what comes next, adjusting around that initial figure. Although the adjustment can be conscious or unconscious, it is rarely enough to move significantly away from the original anchor. This explains why a high initial price in a negotiation can influence subsequent offers, even if the real price should be much lower. The anchoring technique is widely used in marketing and sales. For example, on a restaurant menu, it is common to find an extremely expensive dish at the top of the list. Although few customers choose it, its presence makes the other dishes, which may also be costly, seem more reasonable by comparison. Another common example is discounts. Stores often display the original high price next to the discounted price, so the discount appears more significant, even if the discounted price is the product's true value. In negotiations, anchoring can be a powerful tool to influence the outcome. Suppose you are negotiating a salary for a new job. If you mention a high figure first, the employer is likely to adjust their offer around that amount, even if they initially had a lower number in mind. Similarly, if you are selling a product, starting with a high initial price can increase the perceived value, making it easier to accept a more reasonable counteroffer. However, you can also use anchoring to protect yourself from its influence. If you know you are being anchored by an initial price or an arbitrary figure, make a conscious effort to seek additional information and evaluate the situation objectively. For example, if you are buying a car, research average market prices before negotiating so you are not swayed by the seller's initial price. The more information you have, the less likely the initial anchor will influence your decision. Anchoring does not work only with numbers. It also affects how we perceive situations and people. For instance, if someone introduces a person to you by describing them as kind and hardworking, you are more likely to interpret their behavior through that lens, even if they show signs to the contrary. This effect can also influence how we see ourselves. If you constantly tell yourself that you are incapable of doing something, that initial belief can become an anchor that limits your potential. To use anchoring effectively, it is crucial to set the initial anchor before the other party does. In a negotiation, be the first to mention a number. In a presentation or discussion, introduce first the argument you want to carry the most weight. It is also important to be ethical in its application. Using misleading or manipulative anchors can damage your credibility and your long-term relationships. One practical way to use this technique in everyday life is to set your own internal anchors. For example, if you want to save money, you can set an initial budget that is lower than what you actually need. This will help you spend less because your mind will adjust around that anchor. Similarly, if you are working toward a personal goal, such as exercising or learning a new skill, set a high initial target. Even if you do not fully reach it, the effort to adjust toward that anchor will take you further than you would have gone without it. In summary, the anchoring technique is a psychological tactic that takes advantage of our tendency to rely on the first information we receive. From sales and marketing to negotiations and personal development, this phenomenon influences our decisions more than we realize. Using it consciously can give you a significant advantage, as long as you do so in an ethical and strategic way. Remember, the first impression not only matters, it can define the rest of the game. Why does something seem more valuable when it's hard to obtain? This phenomenon is known as the scarcity effect, a powerful psychological tactic that plays with our perception of value and urgency. When a resource, product, or even an opportunity is perceived as limited, we automatically desire it more. This effect is deeply rooted in our psychology, and understanding how it works can help you both make more conscious decisions and use it strategically in your daily life. The scarcity effect is based on a fundamental principle of human behavior. We value things more when they seem rare or exclusive. When something is limited, we fear losing the opportunity to obtain it, which creates a sense of urgency and increases its appeal. This behavior has evolutionary roots. In the past, access to limited resources was essential for survival, and this instinct continues to influence our modern decisions. The most common example of this effect can be found in marketing. Phrases such as "last units available," "limited time offer," or "only 2 rooms left" are used to trigger our need to act quickly. Even if we do not need the product or service, the idea of missing out pushes us to make impulsive decisions. A classic example is the well-known Black Friday, where the feeling of scarcity and time pressure lead people to compete frantically for products that in other contexts they might not desire as much. The scarcity effect does not apply only to physical products. It also affects how we value time, experiences, and relationships. For example, an exclusive event that can only be attended by invitation is perceived as more valuable than one that is open to the general public. In relationships, people who seem less available or harder to reach often generate greater interest and attraction, simply because we perceive their time and attention as limited resources. The key to this effect lies in our aversion to loss. According to studies in behavioral psychology, people prefer to avoid losing something rather than gaining something of equal value. That is why, when we feel that something might run out or disappear, our mind automatically classifies it as valuable, even if it was not before. This cognitive bias leads us to make decisions based on emotion rather than logic. How can you use the scarcity effect to your advantage? If you're selling a product or service, create a sense of urgency or exclusivity. For example, offer time-limited discounts or special editions with limited quantities. If you're looking to stand out in a professional or social opportunity, highlight what makes you unique or hard to find. However, it is important to use this technique ethically. Manipulating the perception of scarcity in a dishonest way can damage your reputation and people's trust in you. You can also protect yourself from the scarcity effect by being aware of how it works. The next time you feel pressured to make an impulsive decision out of fear of missing an opportunity, pause and evaluate. Do you really need or want what is being offered? Ask yourself whether you would act the same way if availability were not a factor. This simple exercise can help you make more rational decisions and avoid regret later. An interesting aspect of the scarcity effect is how it can motivate us to make better use of our time and resources. For example, knowing that our time in a place is limited, such as during a vacation, makes us appreciate it more and make the most of it. Similarly, being aware that certain opportunities are unique pushes us to act with greater determination and purpose. In summary, the scarcity effect is a psychological tactic that takes advantage of our perception of value and our aversion to loss. From marketing to personal relationships, this phenomenon deeply influences our decisions and behaviors. By understanding how it works, you can use it strategically to highlight your products, services, or even your personal qualities. But most importantly, you can protect yourself from falling into its traps and make more conscious and balanced decisions. Remember, what is limited can be attractive, but not everything that seems scarce is truly worth it. Why do we so often make decisions based on what others do or think? This phenomenon, known as the bandwagon effect, is a powerful psychological influence that leads us to adopt beliefs, ideas, or behaviors simply because other people are doing so. This effect, deeply rooted in our need to belong and be accepted, can shape our daily choices, from fashion to our political opinions. Here we will explore how it works, why it is so effective, and how you can use it to your advantage or protect yourself from its influence. The bandwagon effect is based on our natural tendency to seek social validation. As human beings, we are social creatures who value group acceptance. When we see that many people are doing something, we assume it must be the right choice or that it has value. This phenomenon can be positive, such as when we adopt healthy habits because they are popular, but it can also lead us to make poorly informed or even risky decisions simply by following the crowd. A classic example of the bandwagon effect can be found in the world of trends and fashion. If a famous celebrity starts wearing a specific type of clothing, many people are likely to imitate that style. The same happens with technology products. When we see that a new smartphone becomes a sales success, we tend to think it must be the best one, even if we have not researched its features. The bandwagon effect is also evident in the political arena. During elections, voters tend to support the candidate they perceive as the frontrunner simply because others are doing so. This effect can be amplified by the media and social networks, where popular opinions are highlighted and generate even more support. But why does this psychological influence work so well? The answer lies in two main factors: social validation and the fear of being left out. When we follow the crowd, we feel that we are making a safe decision backed by others. At the same time, we fear missing out on something important if we do not participate. This fear of being left out, known by the acronym FOMO, which stands for fear of missing out, reinforces our need to align ourselves with what the majority is doing. How can you use the bandwagon effect to your advantage? If you are promoting a product, service, or idea, show evidence that many people are already supporting or using it. Positive reviews, testimonials, and large numbers, such as more than 1 million satisfied users, are effective ways to take advantage of this effect. On social media, likes, comments, and shares are visual signals that indicate popularity and can attract even more attention. However, it is important to be ethical when using this strategy. Manipulating people into following a trend without providing real value can damage your reputation in the long term. Instead, focus on highlighting the genuine benefits of what you are promoting and use the bandwagon effect as reinforcement, not as the only argument. On the other hand, you can also protect yourself from this effect by becoming more aware of how it influences your decisions. The next time you feel drawn to something just because it is popular, ask yourself whether you truly need it or whether you are being influenced by others' behavior. Research and evaluate your options on your own before making a decision. The bandwagon effect applies not only to trends, but also to our opinions and beliefs. For example, if you are in a meeting and most people agree with an idea, you may feel pressure to align with them even if you are not fully convinced. In these cases, it is helpful to remember that following the crowd does not always mean it's the best decision. Dare to question and make choices based on your own values and analysis. In summary, the bandwagon effect is a powerful psychological influence that pushes us to follow the crowd in order to feel safe and accepted. From fashion to political decisions, this phenomenon deeply affects our daily lives. By understanding how it works, you can use it strategically to promote your ideas or products, but also to make more informed and authentic decisions. Remember, being part of the crowd can be comforting, but it is not always the right path. Sometimes the most valuable thing is to pause, reflect, and decide for yourself. Have you ever wondered why the songs you listen to repeatedly end up growing on you? Or why you prefer products from brands you already know? This is due to the familiarity effect, also known as the mere exposure effect. This psychological mechanism is based on our tendency to develop a preference for things simply because they feel familiar to us. It is a powerful phenomenon that influences our daily choices, from what we buy to how we relate to other people. In this text, we will explore how it works, why it affects us so strongly, and how you can use it in your life. The familiarity effect was first described by psychologist Robert Zajonc in the 1960s. In his experiments, Zajonc discovered that people tend to prefer words, images, or sounds they have seen or heard multiple times, even if they do not consciously remember them. This phenomenon occurs because familiarity makes us feel safe and comfortable, while the unfamiliar can trigger uncertainty or distrust. Essentially, our minds associate repetition with something positive and reliable. A classic example of this effect appears in advertising. Brands constantly repeat their messages and logos across different media to increase familiarity with the audience. Even if you initially ignore an advertisement, after seeing it several times, you may begin to feel a subconscious connection with the brand. This effect is also evident in music. Songs that we hear repeatedly on the radio or in our playlists often become more appealing over time, even if they did not attract us at first. The familiarity effect also plays an important role in our personal relationships. We are more likely to feel sympathy for people we see frequently, such as coworkers or neighbors, simply because they feel familiar to us. This explains why relationships often develop in environments where there is repetition, such as at work, school, or regular social activities. In the professional world, this effect is used in marketing and sales to build trust with customers. For example, companies send regular emails, post content on social media, and advertise on different platforms to maintain their presence in the public's mind. The more familiar a brand feels, the more likely people are to trust it and purchase its products or services. How can you use the familiarity effect in your life? If you are working on a project or a business, make sure your message, logo, or product is consistently visible. Repetition helps build an emotional connection with your audience. For example, If you are creating content on social media, post regularly to stay present in your followers' minds. If you are looking for a job, participate in industry-related events or activities so people see you often and remember you. In personal relationships, you can apply this effect by spending quality time with the people you want to strengthen your bonds with. Familiarity not only generates liking, but also trust. Even small, regular interactions, such as messages or brief meetups, can make a big difference in how others perceive you. On the other hand, it is important to be aware of how this effect can influence your decisions without you realizing it. For example, you may feel drawn to a product or service simply because you have seen it many times, without considering whether it is truly the best option. To avoid impulsive decisions, it is helpful to analyze whether you are choosing something because it is familiar or because you genuinely need or value it. An interesting application of the familiarity effect is in learning. If you are studying a new topic, repetition is key to absorbing the information and feeling more comfortable with it. The more you expose your mind to a concept, the more familiar it becomes, which makes you like it more and motivates you to keep learning. Summary. The familiarity effect is a powerful psychological mechanism that influences our preferences and decisions. By repeatedly exposing us to something, from marketing to personal relationships and learning, this phenomenon plays an important role in how we interact with the world. By understanding how it works, you can use it strategically to strengthen connections, build trust, and make more conscious decisions. Remember, familiarity makes us feel comfortable, but being aware of this effect will help you balance what is known with the exploration of new possibilities. Have you ever felt instantly connected to someone without knowing exactly why? It is likely that this person was using, consciously or unconsciously, the mirroring technique. This psychological tactic consists of subtly imitating another person's gestures, posture, facial expressions, or tone of voice. By doing so, a sense of harmony and trust is created that strengthens the relationship. The mirroring technique is a powerful tool used in sales, negotiations, and even personal relationships to generate empathy and connection. The foundation of this technique lies in our social nature. As human beings, we are programmed to feel drawn to those who are similar to us. This affinity is called social mimicry and often happens automatically. For example, if you are talking to someone and you cross your arms, it is possible that the other person will do the same without realizing it. This subconscious reflection makes us feel more comfortable and connected to the other person. Studies have shown that subtle imitation can influence how people perceive us. In an experiment conducted by social psychologist Tanya Chartrand and researcher John Bargh, participants who were imitated by an actor felt more comfortable and were more likely to describe the interaction as positive. This happens because unconscious mimicry reinforces our need for belonging and social validation. The mirroring technique is especially useful in professional contexts. For example, if you are in a job interview, you can subtly imitate the interviewer's posture or body language to create an atmosphere of trust. Similarly, in a negotiation, reflecting the other person's tone of voice or speaking speed can make it easier to reach an agreement by helping them feel understood. In personal relationships, this technique can help you build stronger bonds. If you are in a conversation with a friend or partner, mirroring their body language or using words similar to the ones they use can make them feel more valued and understood. However, the key is to do it subtly. If the imitation is too obvious, it may be perceived as mocking or manipulative. Using the mirroring technique requires mindfulness and practice. Here are some practical steps to apply it. Observe carefully before you begin to mirror. Pay close attention to the other person's gestures, tone of voice, and body language, and identify subtle patterns you can reflect. imitate naturally. It is not about copying every movement, but about subtly reflecting key aspects. For example, if the other person is sitting with their hands on the table, you can adopt a similar posture after a few seconds. Match the rhythm. If the other person speaks quickly or slowly, adjust your speed to match theirs. This creates a sense of harmony in the conversation. Be aware of limits. Avoid imitating behaviors that are too personal or exaggerated. The goal is to generate empathy, not discomfort. It is important to mention that this technique should be used ethically and authentically. The goal is not to manipulate, but to create an environment of trust and genuine connection. When used honestly, it can significantly improve your relationships and your ability to communicate with others. On the other hand, being aware of this technique can also help you recognize when someone is using it with you. This does not mean you should become distrustful, but recognizing mimicry can give you an advantage in important interactions, such as negotiations or interviews. The mirroring technique also has applications in personal development. For example, if you want to improve your empathy, practicing this technique can help you better tune in to other people's emotions and behaviors. In addition, it is a useful tool for gaining confidence in social settings by making interactions feel smoother and more natural. In summary, the mirroring technique is a powerful psychological tactic that takes advantage of our natural tendency towards social mimicry. From professional settings to personal relationships, this technique can help you create stronger bonds, build trust, and improve your communication skills. By using it consciously and ethically, you can strengthen your connections with others and become a better communicator. Remember, sometimes reflecting a little of others is the key to building meaningful relationships. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you felt that someone did not believe in your abilities and that negatively affected your performance? This happens because of the inverse Pygmalion effect, a psychological phenomenon in which the low expectations others have of us end up influencing our performance in a negative way. It is a powerful, though dangerous, mechanism that can limit people's potential if it is not addressed properly. Here we will explore how it works, why it is so impactful, and how to avoid falling into its trap. The inverse Pygmalion effect is the counterpart of the Pygmalion effect, which shows that high and positive expectations can boost a person's performance. In this case, when someone holds a negative perception or low expectations about our abilities, we tend to internalize those beliefs and adjust our performance to match them, often without realizing it. This phenomenon becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, where the lack of external confidence erodes our own confidence. A classic example of this effect occurs in the educational setting. If a teacher has low expectations of a student, they are less likely to provide the support needed for that student to reach their potential. As a result, the student may interpret this lack of support as a sign that they are truly not capable, which affects their motivation and performance. This cycle is reinforced as poor performance confirms the teacher's expectations, perpetuating the problem. The inverse Pygmalion effect also appears in the workplace. A manager who assumes that an employee is not competent may assign them less challenging tasks or provide fewer opportunities for growth. This not only limits the employee's development, but also reinforces the perception that they are not capable of taking on greater responsibilities. In personal relationships, low expectations can lead to toxic dynamics in which one person feels they will never be good enough to meet another's demands. Why does this effect work? Largely because of our need for social validation. As human beings, we seek the approval of others and tend to adjust ourselves to the expectations placed on us, whether positive or negative. When we feel that little is expected of us, our motivation decreases, and this directly affects our performance. The good news is that by becoming aware of this phenomenon, we can counteract its effects. Here are some strategies. Recognize low expectations. If you sense that someone has a negative perception of you, do not internalize it immediately. Instead, identify whether those expectations are truly based on facts or on prejudice. Reaffirm your abilities. Build your confidence by remembering your achievements and skills. Surrounding yourself with people who believe in you and support you can help counteract negative influences. Prove your worth. Although it can be frustrating, sometimes it is necessary to demonstrate your abilities in order to change others' perceptions. Use these situations as an opportunity to stand out. Offer positive support. If you are in a position of influence, such as a teacher, leader, or friend, make sure to communicate positive expectations to those around you. Your belief in others can make a significant difference in their performance. The inverse Pygmalion effect also teaches us the importance of self-affirmation. While others' opinions can influence us, we have the power to decide whether we allow those perceptions to define us. Strengthening our self-esteem and developing a growth mindset can help us overcome the limitations imposed by low external expectations. In summary, the inverse Pygmalion effect is a psychological mechanism that shows how low expectations can negatively affect a person's performance. From education to professional and personal environments, this phenomenon has a significant impact on our lives. By recognizing it and acting consciously, we can break this cycle and foster an environment where people feel valued and capable of reaching their full potential. Remember, your beliefs and those of others not only influence what you do, but also who you can become. Have you ever noticed that something seems better or worse depending on what you compare it to? This psychological phenomenon is known as the contrast principle, and it is a powerful tool that influences how we perceive value, quality, and available options. It is used in sales, negotiations, and marketing to shape our decisions, but it also affects our daily lives in more subtle ways. Here, we will explore how it works, why it is so influential, and how you can use it or protect yourself from it. The contrast principle is based on the idea that our brain evaluates things in relation to what surrounds them, rather than analyzing them in isolation. This means that an object, an offer, or even a person can seem more attractive or less desirable depending on the context in which it is presented. For example, if you see a luxurious house followed by a more modest one, the second is likely to seem less appealing than it would if you saw it on its own. This effect occurs because our brain creates an initial reference point and judges what comes next in relation to it. A classic example of the contrast principle occurs in sales. Imagine that you are buying a suit in a store. The salesperson first shows you an expensive suit priced at 1,000 euros and then presents another one priced at 500 euros. Even though 500 euros is still a high price, it seems more reasonable in comparison with the first one. This tactic works because the contrast between the two options changes your perception of value. The contrast principle is also used in marketing. Brands often include a premium version of their products, not necessarily to sell it, but to make the more affordable version seem like a bargain. For example, a restaurant menu may include an extremely expensive dish that makes the other items appear more accessible, even if you would otherwise consider them expensive. This effect is not limited to goods and services. It also affects how we evaluate situations and relationships. For instance, if you are in a job interview and the interviewer sees a mediocre candidate before meeting you, they are more likely to perceive you as more competent by comparison. Similarly, in personal relationships, we may perceive someone as more attractive or interesting depending on whom we compare them to. So how can you use the contrast principle to your advantage? If you work in sales or marketing, present a premium option first before showing more affordable alternatives. This will establish a reference point that makes the less expensive options seem more appealing. If you're negotiating a salary, start by asking for a higher amount than you expect to receive. This will make your ideal figure seem more reasonable in comparison. In everyday life, you can use this principle to make more informed decisions. For example, if you are evaluating different options, compare them to a higher standard to make sure you're choosing the best one. However, it is important to be aware of how this phenomenon can influence your decisions unconsciously. Protecting yourself from the contrast principle requires paying attention to how options are presented to you. Ask yourself whether you are evaluating something based on its true merit or simply in comparison with something else. For example, if you are considering an offer in the store, think about whether you really need the product or if it only seems like a good deal because it is being compared to something more expensive. In summary, the contrast principle is a psychological tactic that deeply affects our perceptions and decisions by highlighting differences between options. From sales and marketing to everyday life, this principle can be a powerful tool when used strategically and ethically. By understanding how it works, you can take advantage of it to influence others or make more conscious and balanced decisions. Remember, what seems good or bad may depend more on what surrounds it than on its intrinsic value. Have you ever found yourself continuing with something that no longer makes sense simply because you have already invested time, money, or effort into it? This phenomenon is called the sunk cost fallacy, and it is a psychological trap that affects our decisions more than we might imagine. It leads us to keep committing to something that is not working just because we feel we have already invested too much to walk away. From relationships to work projects, this fallacy influences our daily lives and, if we are not aware of it, can push us to make irrational choices. The sunk cost fallacy occurs because our minds strongly dislike the idea of losing what we have already invested. We want to justify our past actions by continuing with them, even when they are no longer beneficial. It is as if we believe that by investing more, we can somehow recover what has already been lost, when in reality, we are often just increasing the damage. A classic example of this fallacy appears in the business world. Imagine a company that has spent millions of euros developing a product, but after launching it, the market response is poor. Instead of stopping further investment and cutting its losses, the company may continue to spend more money on advertising and improvements, trying to justify the initial costs, even though the data clearly shows that the product will never be profitable. In everyday life, the sunk cost fallacy shows up in situations such as staying in a relationship that no longer makes you happy simply because you have been in it for years, or continuing to watch a boring movie just because you have already spent 1 hour watching it. It can also appear in small decisions, like finishing a plate of food at a restaurant, even when you are already full, simply because you paid for it. Why do we fall into this fallacy? The answer lies mainly in two factors: our aversion to losses and our need for consistency. Losses, whether of time, money, or effort, are psychologically painful, and we do everything we can to avoid them, even if that means making the situation worse. In addition, we want to feel that our past decisions were correct, so we continue to support them even when they no longer make sense. How can you avoid falling into the sunk cost fallacy? Here are some practical tips. Focus on the present, not the past. When making decisions, concentrate on future benefits rather than past investments. Ask yourself whether you would choose the same option if you were starting from scratch. Accept losses. Admitting that you have lost something is not easy, but it is the first step toward avoiding even greater losses. Remember that walking away from something that is not working is not a failure, but a smart decision. Set limits. Before starting a project or investment, define how much time or money you are willing to commit. If you reach that limit and see no results, have the courage to stop. Ask for a second opinion. Sometimes we are too emotionally involved in a situation to evaluate it objectively. Talking to someone you trust can help you see things from a different perspective. On the other hand, if you understand how the sunk cost fallacy works, you can also use it strategically. For example, in sales or marketing, highlighting a customer's previous investments can motivate them to continue. However, it is important to use this tactic ethically, making sure that what you are offering truly benefits the other person. In summary, the sunk cost fallacy is a psychological trap that makes us cling to past decisions out of fear of accepting losses. Although it is a natural tendency, being aware of it allows us to make more rational decisions and avoid greater sacrifices. Remember, sometimes walking away from something that is not working is not giving up, but making room for something better. Learn to let go and focus on what truly matters: the future. Have you ever assumed that most people share your opinion or see the world the same way you do? This happens because of the false consensus effect, a psychological bias that leads us to overestimate the extent to which our beliefs, values, or behaviors are shared by others. This phenomenon not only affects how we perceive other people, but also how we make decisions and relate to the world around us. The false consensus effect was first studied by psychologists Lee Ross, David Green, and Pamela House in the 1970s. In one of their experiments, participants were asked to choose between two options and then predict what the majority would do. The results showed that most people believed others would make the same choice they did, even when there was no evidence to support that assumption. This bias occurs because we tend to project our own experiences, values, and thoughts onto others. As a result, we assume that our way of thinking is normal or correct, and that others should think the same way. This can make us feel validated, but it can also lead us to underestimate the diversity of perspectives and behaviors. The false consensus effect appears in many aspects of our daily lives. For example, in political debates, it is common for people to assume that their opinions are shared by most of society, especially if they mainly interact with others who hold similar beliefs. In personal relationships, this effect can cause misunderstandings when we assume that our partner, friends, or colleagues see things the same way we do. In marketing and business, the false consensus effect can lead to strategic mistakes. For instance, an entrepreneur might assume that a product will be successful because it seems useful or appealing to them, without considering whether it truly meets the needs and preferences of the market. Similarly, a business leader might design strategies based on what they believe employees or customers want, without first asking or researching. So how can you avoid falling into the false consensus effect? Here are some helpful tips. Seek different perspectives. Talk to people who have opinions, experiences, or backgrounds different from your own. This will help you broaden your understanding of how others see the world. Ask questions instead of making assumptions. Rather than assuming you know what others think or want, ask them directly. This not only reduces misunderstandings, but also strengthens your relationships. Rely on objective data. If you're making important decisions, use research, surveys, or studies instead of relying solely on intuition or personal experience. Be aware of your social bubble. Recognize that the people you regularly interact with may not represent society as a whole. Expand your horizons and look for opinions outside your usual circle. On the other hand, understanding this effect can also help you influence others in a strategic way. If you are presenting an idea or proposal, you can take advantage of the false consensus effect by mentioning how others already agree with or support your idea. This can create a sense of social validation and increase the likelihood of acceptance. However, it is important to use this strategy ethically and support it with real facts. In summary, the false consensus effect is a psychological bias that makes us believe our ideas and values are more universal than they really are. While it can make us feel comfortable, It can also limit our ability to understand and connect with others. By becoming aware of this effect, we can make more informed decisions, improve our relationships, and be more open to the diversity of perspectives that exist in the world. Remember, the key is not to assume that everyone thinks like you, but to accept and appreciate differences.